Neuroplasticity is a topic that's especially close to my heart for the very exciting implications that it has. Essentially, what neuroplasticity means is that your brain can change itself without medical intervention, without surgery. Changes can take place within the way that your brain is wired and works. Now, we know that during pregnancy, the brain creates and generates brain cells. And that's a process that generally happens throughout pregnancy, but stops pretty much after birth. Your brain is not going to be making much more new cells. And for a very long time, we believed that unfortunately, you have what you have. You're born with the amount of brain cells that you have, and there's nothing we could do about that. What we didn't realize is that it's not so much about the amount of brain cells that you have within your brain, but it's about the connections between those brain cells and the important impact that has on the way that your brain functions. And recently we found out that those connections keep on forming throughout your lifespan. More and more connections can form to make sure that the brain works more efficiently. Now, if you look at a piece of brain that's about the size of a grain of rice, there are almost 10,000 brain cells within that little piece of brain. And each one of those brain cells can make up to about 10,000 connections with other brain cells. So the potential is absolutely huge. Those wires, those connections, essentially is what makes sure that the brain works well. But your brain is very, very efficient at housekeeping. So we know that those brain regions, those neural pathways that are used often will be quite strong, they'll be there and they'll work quite well. One of the implications of neuroplasticity is that if a certain part of your brain fails, other parts of the brain can actually take over the function of that specific part that has failed. And your brain can also change to new and different circumstances. It can adapt all the time. Given the right conditions, your brain is sometimes able to learn things that it just wasn't able to do before. So I want to chat to you about the 4 most important underlying principles for neuroplasticity to be able to happen. The first is that we have to use it or lose it. So when I was talking before about the maintenance and how the brain goes and looks for networks that aren't being used, if there's a function that you're not doing, a task that you're not practicing often enough, the brain will actually stop that neural network. It will get rid of those connections because it feels that it's just wasting space within the brain. So very importantly, make sure that if there's a task that you want to accomplish, that you practice it over and over. Repetition matters. So like I've just said, think about it a little bit as weightlifting for the brain. Initially, if you're doing weightlifting or something that's difficult, you're battling to actually lift up those weights. But with every single day you do it, that becomes easier and easier. And it's exactly the same within the brain. The 4th very important principle is that neurons that fire together wire together. And what that really comes down to is that your brain very rarely relies only of one part to perform a specific function. Often when we do even a simple task, there are lots of different parts of the brain that have to all work together. And the more that you do that, the more those different areas of the brain fire together and are alerted at the same time, the better connections are going to be built and those regions will work effectively and will work together better. And the 4th very important principle is timely motivation. So if you have just done a specific task and there's a reward, you feel good about it, you got it, that neural pathway will be reinforced specifically, and the more reward you get and the more often you do it, the stronger that neural pathway will become. So what are the implications if we look at children and neuroplasticity? Why is it so important? The first thing that we know is that with children, even just knowing about neuroplasticity, that can already make a change in their motivation. Recently, scientists divided children who were struggling at school into two different groups. And the first group, they just let carry on as per normal. And with the second group, they showed them a video about neuroplasticity and how your brain can change. And when they took all those children back to class, after a week or so, the teacher reported that the children who had seen that video were much more motivated and much more keen to learn and to try than they were before, because they understood that their brains could change. The second thing, based on that use it or lose it principle, is that parents have to specifically resist the urge to try and overhelp their children. It's very important for your child to learn to perform a specific task on his own as far as possible for those brain regions to develop, for those neural networks to develop within the brain. We also know that age matters. Neural networks can develop throughout the brain, throughout the entire lifespan. But unfortunately, the younger you are, the better those neural pathways are built. And so that just really reinforces the idea of early intervention. When we find that a child struggles with a specific thing, it's very important to make sure that we get the intervention they need as early as possible. Based on the principles that neurons fire together, then wire together, we know that what we have to do is to try and involve as many different modalities and as many different senses, because when your brain can rely on information from all different parts of the brain to work together, we know that that neural pathway is going to become very strong and it can work quite effectively and quickly. So based on the principle of timely motivation, there are two aspects here that are important. The first is that it's important to give appropriate praise for children's efforts and what they've tried to do and accomplished. But secondly, we know that it's important for children to find enjoyment in a task. When they do something that they enjoy, there's going to be that immediate reward and that innate reward that is going to ensure that the neural networks are properly built. A good example of how the different regions of the brain have to work together, for instance, is just a simple task like talking. For the brain to be able to produce speech, it has to use the language areas, so areas that will actually process the meaning of language, areas that will process the production of language, and then the motor cortex as well, so being able to actually form the muscle movements and the tongue movements to get those sounds out. So even simple tasks use lots of different regions all together. The implication of this is that the early intervention is so very important that if you find that there might be a developmental delay in language, for instance, it's very important to make sure that we get that help as soon as possible.